Welcome to the Reach the Stars podcast, a collection of conversations with cool people who do cool things. Brought to you by Papercraft Miracles. Each week, we'll bring you inspiring stories of persistence, passion, and purpose. With your host, Jonna Willoughby Lohr.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reach the Stars podcast. I am your host, Jonna Willoughby Lohr. Today, my guest is an amazing poet and educator and arts and cultural strategist, Dr. Adam Falkner. Welcome to the podcast. Do you want to just jump in and let people know a little bit more about who you are and where you come from?
Sure. Thank you, Jenna, for having me. I'm excited to chat with y'all for a little while. My name is Adam Falkner. I'm a poet, an educator. My work for the last decade and a half has really been dedicated to creating spaces for people to tell stories that help them be more courageous actors in their own lives. I run and curate several projects. The one that is most notable perhaps to me is called the Dialogue Arts Project. It is an org that uses creative writing and the arts as tools to help people talk about issues of identity and difference. So in many ways have been trying to utilize and leverage the art in my own life as a poet to help folks really engage difficult conversations that otherwise are really hard to access. I come from a tradition of critical education. I taught high school English for many years in New York City. And yeah, I mean, what else can I offer that would round out the corners? I'm not going to run down the bio here.
So I'm actually curious about where you were born.
I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I am a Midwestern baby at heart. I live in New York City, where I have been for the better part of the last, 13 years. I graduated from the University of Michigan as an undergrad and accepted a teaching fellowship to come out to New York, which is a really good deal, you know, to teach for a couple years, immediately start making a salary. You get to hang out with young people in the most incredible city on the planet and learn about yourself in the process. And you get a free master's degree out the deal. So if you can tough it, then great. I expected it would be kind of a 2-year and out situation. Education is in the lifeblood of my family. So I knew that would be a space I carved for myself in the future. I just didn't think it would be classroom teaching. But after 2 years, I turned it into 3, which turned into 5, which turned into 7, and was just given a really remarkable gift through my school leadership to create a curriculum that really became the sort of guiding set of principles for what is now the consulting group that I run and operate with companies and teachers across the country to help folks dive into difficult dialogues around issues of race and gender and sex and other characteristics of identity.
I love that. I think that is so cool that you're just really living the change that you want to see. And you're like, I mean, in a lot of ways that like bridging those conversations, starting those conversations, making space for those conversations to happen. I just think that it's so integral to making change is to make those spaces accessible to people. And I just love that you're doing that. It's great.
Thank you.
That's very admirable. I like it. So obviously you have a couple of books, or maybe even more than a couple of books. I mean, every slam poet probably has, I mean, quote unquote slam poet, right? Capital P poet, but has probably a couple of those, like I made this photocopied chapbook at Kinko's back in the early 2000s, you know, like everybody has a couple of those. But as far as like, you know, books that are readily available with a barcode on the back, do you want to talk a little bit about your books?
Sure. I mean, I'd be delighted to talk, I think, first and most directly about The Willies, which is my brand new book in the world. The Willies is, I mean, it's still a delight to hold, but it came out a couple months ago. And it is really telling 2 stories, right? It's telling two parallel narratives side by side. The first is really, it's the story of my own sort of like coming into queerhood and coming out as a gay man. And it's wrestling with questions of gender and masculinity. And the other is the story of my father's descent into and recovery from substance abuse and substance addiction. And it's really trying to tell those stories side by side, and the various costumes that both he and I hid from ourselves in to avoid, having those difficult conversations with ourselves about who we are and what we wanted to be in the world. And I, for me, some of those costumes or those like parading spaces were ones around gender. There were ones around race and whiteness. And for him, they were in many cases just sort of avoiding and sidestepping what it was that was driving him to consume and to drink. And it is also a story of recovery, both for me and for him, and the ways in which those two stories are really linked. So I'm excited about that book. I'm excited that it exists in the world, and was on a 2-day tour and lecture talk in Boston when the rolling blackout cancellations from COVID settled in and canceled the next 3.5 months of a book tour, which is true of so many people that are out there rallying for projects they have in the world. But it feels good to be able to talk about it and celebrate it in small ways with folks like you. So thanks for asking about it.
Well, there will definitely be links to where you can buy the book. And I am excited to dive into that world. I am really all about people's formative years, childhood, adolescence, how that experience in everyone's life really shapes who they become as an adult, and that the experiences that they have as a young person just really stick with you in certain ways, either for good or for bad. So I think there's and stories of people's families and not necessarily tragedy of your family, you know what I mean? But people actually really reflecting on the difficult things that people go through, and not just writing about oh, look at how nice everything is.
Really not here for the birds and the bees these days. We don't have time for that shit. The world is melting. People are dying. We might as well tell the truth.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my goodness. I'm hopeful that once these episodes come out, I want to have the listeners vote on what their favorite quote is from each episode. And then I'll be making t-shirts or stickers or something out of the quotes and splitting them and whatnot. So I'm super curious to see which quotes come to light out of this conversation. That's probably one of them. The world is melting. There's no time for not being truthful.
There never was a time to not be telling the truth. The stakes have always been too high, but I think truly the moment that we're encountering right now requires for a personalization of the stakes, right? It isn't, we're recording this podcast on June 26th in the year 2020, when we are every day wrestling both with the realities of a global pandemic and the centuries deep reality that Black Americans specifically in this country have been historically terrorized. And here, we are hitting the streets to protest that their lives matter still. And it's wild to think that we're in fact still writing poems about fields with horses in them. Because I believe in poetry as a tool and as a vehicle to articulate without craft the inarticulatable, right? To say the thing. And I think at a moment that we're in now, I'm reading a lot of poets because poetry is not a luxury. Shout out to our Lord, right? It is a thing that life sustains us, that calls us to the streets, calls us into ourselves, and it calls us to stand up for things we believe in.
I've been thinking going back and reading a bunch of June Jordan poems, and she was one of my first introductions into very overt political writing and how it interacts with somebody's life and the power that it has to change people. I ended up being part of like a June Jordan cipher in the fall of 2002 at the Dodge Poetry Festival. And it was just so interesting to like hear her voice read by so many different people. And somebody I didn't even know what was going on. I was walking past the gazebo and people were like, this is what's happening. And they shoved the book in my face, said, pick a poem and go up there and read it. And I ended up randomly just picking this poem from the Talking Back of Miss Valentine Jones, poem number 2, I think it is. And so for anyone listening, go find that poem and read it. But it just, the way that it was so written in her voice, and I think it was really good for me to like feel uncomfortable in my own whiteness trying to read her poem in her voice. And I think that having those experiences as a white person, feeling uncomfortable and like wondering if you're doing the right thing by trying to share somebody's voice was a good kind of step into recognizing my own privilege and figuring out ways to use it for the benefit of others and not for myself.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of like costuming in the life of the boy that is central to this book, right? The Willies. It's one of like cultural appropriation, right? It's one of like experimenting with cultures that were not my own because they made me feel slightly more distanced from the like obese, gluttonous inheritance that existed in my life that I was too scared to name. Of course, the opposite of like whiteness is not blackness. The opposite of whiteness is dismantling white supremacy. But one of those sounds like work, and the other sounds like we can just like parade around in costumes and politicize ourselves in Black culture and listen to Black music and think that we're, doing the work when in really we're running from ourselves or from our sort of larger truths. And that's a thing I'm actually thinking a lot about. A lot of my work historically, but also I think presently, meaning like right now, is really thinking a lot about white people and what we are doing to hold ourselves accountable in a moment when more of us are awake and coming to these real historical questions of reparations for the first time in our lives. And I'm optimistic by the number of white folks that feel enraged and are showing up to protests and are donating money and are diversifying their social media feeds. I'm also really cognizant, though, of how quickly the conversation of what we need white people to be doing right now has drifted into a like self-education space, because the field of like whiteness studies for many, many years, actually, no, from its inception was like meeting white people where we're at, right? It's saying like, in order to get to the reparations argument, you need to first think about your shame, your guilt, your fragility, your cultural appropriation. You need to unwork all those things. You need to wrestle personally with who you've been and where you haven't been in your life in regards to your whiteness. And then once you make it to that final stage, then we're ready to talk about the redistribution of wealth in this country, right? People are really excited to hashtag Black Lives Matter until we start talking about the redistribution of resources. But the thing I think I'm wrestling with is that I see so many loved ones coming to this work and reading the work, right? Reading Rob DiAngelo's White Fragility, reading Ibram Kendi's work, reading Tim Wise, reading Carol Anderson. But I think there's a lot of like scary self-congratulatoryism.
Yeah.
Is today.
What do you mean
that comes from picking up a book and self-educating, when what we actually really need people to do right now is like believe in and act toward reparations in this country, right? Like, and that's the thing I think I'm wrestling with a lot, is that like I do believe a lot of my life's work is dedicated to like getting in the room and saying the things that we need to say in order to like sit down with white people and have meaningful conversations about race and critical identity. But at the same time, it's very easy to slip into convincing ourselves that the reading is the work. The reading is not the work. The reading is like an entrance ticket so that you can then pick up your own and define your own activism and show up in the world in real tangible ways. Mm-hmm. And I'm scared right now that so many white folks that I love are just sort of like going to stop after they read the work and they feel a little bit better that they know about their own white fragility, that we're just going to kind of like feel like we did our part. And while we're out here reading and holding dialogue groups and talking about our shame, people are dying and people are living in systemic poverty, and nothing that we could read is going to change that. So that's something that's really like active on my mind, like how to think 4 months from now, 3 months from now, maybe 3 weeks from now, when a lot of headlines start to shift, when we start to take our attention elsewhere, like what is it going to mean to really convince our white friends and colleagues and loved ones that like that is was just the absolute beginning of an utterance of what this needs to be. So I think I'm sitting really heavily with that and trying to like quietly plot and scheme about how to keep my fellow white loves engaged in work that, the time is right now.
Exactly. I mean, like, in a lot of ways, like educating yourself and reading the books and, sharing resources and things like that is kind of like the orientation for college. Like you go through that like super intense week in order to actually really start studying and working. And you have to do all of that in order to even start being on the same page as people who are actively making change with the knowledge they then have. I mean, when I was in school, I remember that the school I went to, we had like it was like a gifted and talented school. And we learned about, lucky me, I got to go to the gifted and talented school. But we learned about Bloom's taxonomy and the different steps of learning and then applying and using knowledge. And, most people in today's world get stuck in that first step, which is knowledge. But you got to go through knowledge in order to get to comprehension, in order to get to application, in order to get to analysis, and then you get to synthesis and then evaluation. And it's like there's so many steps beyond just knowing right from wrong, as opposed to what do you do with it? Like
that's right. That's right.
You can read the info, but if you don't know how to apply it and you don't know how to, evaluate whether or not what you're doing is useful and pertinent to helping other people, then
totally.
What's the point in reading it in the first place?
And that's such a good analogy, I think, for the way that like critical white identity work, right, has been framed. Because, or even if you know why you're doing it, even if you know what the North Star of your beginning to think about white fragility is, great. And I'm concerned that the way that the field has evolved over the last 25 years, we are not even prepared to tell folks, or honest or courageous enough to tell folks what the North Star in that work is, because it is reparations in a tangible, meaningful way, right? I realize the argument that like people don't have any business thinking about white shame, fragility, and guilt if they don't believe in the redistribution of their own resources in this country, right? And ideally, we would like be able to convince people that both of those things need to happen at the same time, right? Like the tip of the taxonomy of needs or Bloom's work, right, is like, you need to know that is what you're working toward. Otherwise, you just kind of like dip your foot in the room and you're like, sweet, we're working, right? And so much of the field has been catered around white comfort and fear that that's where we stop. We want people to feel accomplished for doing just enough, but like scared to do more. Yeah. And this sort of like self-investigation of fragility is like just enough, but scared to do more. And I wonder what it might look like to treat this stage 6 stuff, the like be active, the like, make a statement of declaration that every Black kid in this country deserves to go to college for free first, and then start thinking about your fragility and your shame, right? It's almost like an entrance ticket as opposed to an exit ticket. Yeah. That's the thing I'm just so conscious about that right now, about how these dialogues are evolving.
that's the given in order to have, you know, an actual debate on the two sides of an argument. You both have to agree that like, this is the premise, this is the given upon which we are going to then have our debate. But if people don't agree that that is the given underneath all of this, then what's the point? You know, like you're never going to be able to have the same conversation, like even two sides of the same conversation, if the basis of the conversation is not the same.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm super glad that, people are having this conversation in the first place.
Sure.
And it is scary thinking about how people are like, oh man, we're going to have to start having those scary conversations. And like, that's the work. And you're like, I mean, those quote unquote scary conversations, like that's like the writing your name at the top of the paper of the work.
Okay.
Like,
hello.
You know, like that's just like the teensiest, tiniest little bit of dipping your toe in the water. And, you know, I've been hearing a lot of white people that I know being like, wow, like this is so much work. This is so exhausting doing all of this research and learning all of this. And I was like, yes, it can be exhausting, but you have to like back up a second to see that, you know, it may feel exhausting to be intentional about learning about race, but can you imagine how exhausting it is to have that be your entire life, even if you like, despite wanting to have it be different, like that's just your whole life is just that. And, you know, that's believing in that premise is like the very basicness of thinking about what life must be like for people of color. And, you know, it is heartening. I mean, I've been listening to Sam Cooke a lot. And I recently found out, like, I've always had like a really deep connection to the song Change Is Gonna Come. And it makes me hopeful to see how different the world is today from when he wrote that song. But it's also really sad to see how many ways the world is still the same as it was when he wrote that song. And it's kind of crazy that like, because of global pandemic and social media, I find out from my uncle, who I don't talk to very often, I shared that song on Facebook, and he's like, that was one of your grandmother's favorite songs. And I had no idea that she even, you know, knew about it or liked it. And so it was kind of cool to like feel that generational connection that my grandmother was like feeling good things and thinking good things about that song, like when it came out. So obviously there's a reason, like somebody is whispering in my ear kind of, you know, from the other side to make me think about that song. And, it does make me think about how change is the kind of thing that happens slowly while you're not really paying attention. In the same way that like kids outgrow their clothes and all of a sudden you're like, yo, when did you stop fitting these shoes? Like, when did that happen? Didn't they fit you yesterday and now they don't fit? And that there are a lot of little changes that have been happening. And because of the global pandemic and so many people are out of work, there's a lot of people who before the pandemic would have been like, oh, I would like to protest, but I have to go to work. And, you know, because of this kind of like fucked up perfect storm that we're in, there are so many people who have the freedom to go out in the streets because they don't have to go to work right now. And that, you know, I think I read a thing the other day that 25 million Americans have participated in protests in the last month. Like, that's probably more people than participated in protests in the last like 15 years.
Yeah, it's powerful.
It's powerful. And that all the little ways that little things have been changing. And I talked about this in the last episode. I have this poem that I wrote after Michael Brown was killed that was about Black Lives Matter, because I kept hearing people saying, but all lives matter, but all lives matter. And this is like when that really started to like be a thing. And the one verse in it, it starts out with like, now this movement has been born. So of course there's got to be resistance, but that's how you know you're gaining ground. To make change, you got to be persistent. And I think that the persistence of so many people for the last several years to really work on educating themselves and other people. And the amount of people who have been having those quote unquote scary conversations, like it's incremental, but there have been little changes. Like, you know, the fact that being Amy Coopered is now like a verb. And that now that there's a precedent for when there's a situation like that the white woman calling the cops on the black guy in the park and she loses her job, that's all new. Yeah. And I mean, it's about damn time, but like when people are really starting to lose hope that things are not changing, I think it's important to look at the little ways that little things like that are changing and that people's perceptions in small ways are changing like that. So yeah. I don't want people to like have no hope out there that like they're fighting and fighting and fighting and that like nothing is ever changing, because they are changing. They're just, they're small in little ways.
It is a moment. It is a hopeful moment. And I don't mean to suggest that it is not. I'm deeply excited. I mean, there's obviously something happening that is unlike anything that we've, you know, probably ever seen. Certainly since the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. I feel like my job isn't to be excited in so much as it is push white people and mm-hmm. push them further mm-hmm. and then push them further than that and convince them now, while the fragility is real, while the guilt is real, while the shame is alive, how to reframe that so that it doesn't become stagnant and cyclical, mm-hmm. which it often does. I think the moment we're living in, people feel a kind of urgency about things like guilt and fragility in a way that, you know, 10 years ago, you just read about guilt and fragility. But now it's very, very clear to folks that guilt and fragility do nothing. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that they're not vital places to begin this work. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't like scare up as much dust as we possibly can. We should keep reading the books and keep holding dialogue groups. But I'm also feeling held to account in my own life and my own work right now about what happens when these conversations start to die down and they get a little more muted in like 3 weeks. Like what then? And how to kindly and courageously continue to call white people in to believing that the work is bigger than just these books. But you're right, it's a groundswell moment, and it's an exciting time. Yeah, for sure. And I'm really glad that there's people like you out in the world who are continuing to stay focused on how, you know, necessary and important all of this work is. And I like that I like your phrasing on like calling the white people in as opposed to calling the white people out. Yeah, well, that doesn't work.
I love that. Just even like a little turn of phrase that it's like, it's not like that people becoming aware of their own privilege is not just a necessary thing. It's a good thing. That is a good thing to bring people together, as opposed to how, you know, typically, you know, it has this kind of negative connotations, like you got to call your white people out. And it's like, in general, I think when people see it as that type of attitude, their value filter just kind of goes bink, and they can't hear anything you have to say because they feel like you're kind of the collective you, not you personally, but, you know, that you're kind of attacking them for something that they don't even see. And
yeah. I mean, if there's anything that my sort of approach to the work, both as like a trainer and like an educational coach to school leaders and stuff like that, there's anything that has taught me, it's that like, you got to meet people where we're at. Mm-hmm. And it's got to be accessible and engaging. And people need to feel like they belong in the dialogues we're asking them to have. They have to. Mm-hmm. But they can't stay there. And so much of how I have come to believe in the importance of powerful space has to do with exactly that, right? Like, how do we create an environment, whether it's a classroom or a corporate boardroom or a summer camp or a university residential training staff? How do we create an environment where folks feel confident, both beginning to interrogate themselves while recognizing that like the self-interrogation is just the very first step toward really enacting like meaningful change. Mm-hmm. But to your point, I think so much of the reason that I have gravitated toward art as that like organizing tool is because it is the thing that called me in, right? It allowed me, there's so many people in my life. Most of them are women of color. Most of them are Black women. They're mentors and educators over the course of 3 decades who have kindly called me out, but called me in and showed me to myself in a way that facilitated my own continued learning, right? And I think about that constantly, both how lucky and fortunate I am to have learned about myself through other people that do not have my experiences, but also that I have the opportunity to be able to sort of like continue that work and that reflection, right? Mm-hmm. We often think about the A in Dialogue Arts Project. Carlos and I talk about this often. It's like, it's the moment at a poetry slam, for example, or when you're coming out of a movie theater with a friend and you're having a conversation about a character that reminds you of your mother, who was also in abusive relationships, and you slept on your uncle's couch for weeks at a time because she was in between spots. And suddenly you're not talking about the poetry slam, or you're not talking about the film, you're talking about yourself. Mm-hmm. And the platform that creativity and shared artistic experiences provide people to enter dialogues that they otherwise might not is unlike anything else. We walk into rooms and we say, let's talk about privilege, ready, go, right? Fuck, no, I'm not talking about privilege. Why would I want to do that? There's 700 people in this room, and when you use the word like that, there's 700 different iterations of like what I think that means, and we're like side-eyeing who's unpacked what and who's further along on their journey. But if what we do is we just show up and we experience an artistic or creative encounter that is courageous and bold, suddenly we start thinking about ourselves in ways that we didn't need language as like a prohibitive paywall to do, you know? So I think a lot about the accessibility piece and how if we're scaring people away from the urgency of the work, then we're only shooting ourselves in the foot. And the delicate dance is both like creating a wide enough entry point into these dialogues so that people feel like they have a personal stake in it, mm-hmm. while also making sure that, you know, we're clear that understanding your own stakes isn't the actual work. It's like working to engage them and like undo them in some ways. I don't know. I'm riffing. Thanks for letting me work out some ideas.
Oh, I love this conversation. I think it's just so important to have conversations with other people about stuff that isn't celebrities and bullshit that just doesn't matter. Like, it's definitely one good thing that I think has come about from the pandemic is that people are realizing how much they miss having face-to-face conversations with people. And in some ways, like, you know, it's on Zoom, but like we are having a face-to-face conversation right now. And that when you're on Zoom, people tend to feel shittier about sitting there dicking around on their phone when someone else is talking than you would if you were actually sitting with them. And yep. I think since people have realize that face-to-face conversations are something that they're really missing having, I'm hopeful that when things are safer and the world does start opening back up, that there will be less interactions with people where there's 6 people at a table and they're all looking at their phones and no one is looking at each other in the face and talking about things. And I'm just so hopeful for, you know, the quote unquote new normal. Sonia Renee Taylor was talking, encouraging people to write like a politic about what they believe the new normal could be. And for me, just being able to re-foster those communication skills for people is so integral in the new normal. Like that it no longer feels awkward to look somebody in the face when you're talking to them, and that it no longer, for me in my own personal, like sharing myself with the world experience, like I don't cry in front of people like ever. And I know that like for me to really open myself and interact with the world, like that is something I need to work on. And like, I need to work that out, and to be able to be open and vulnerable and not just be like rehearsed me that I practiced what I was going to say, and then I go out and I say it and then I come back. So I'm happy and hopeful for a world where people want to explore more of that realness with each other. And that's part of why I wanted to start doing this podcast, because I know that my number one strength in this world is the people that I know. I know some really, really amazing, inspiring people who have wonderful things to share, and stories about overcoming things that are really, really hard. I mean, there's so many times in my life personally that I have come back from something that feels like dying, and then that I wake up and say, and now what? And I'm just like really excited to be able to share people's stories of the now what, and all that. I know you don't have a ton of time, but the end of all the podcasts, I ask all the guests the same 5 questions, because I'm really interested in the ways that people answer these questions in a different way. And it's a little bit like an emotional job interview, I think.
I feel trapped already.
No, I think it's good. I think it's good. So the first one is, tell me about an experience from your life that shaped who you are today. Like one of those moments, like when you have one moment and you're like, wow, after that one experience, that one conversation, that one thing that happened, everything is different.
Let's see. Maybe. Okay. This will be a shout out to a teacher moment, which I always try to make my most formative moments involve, right? Maybe not formal teachers, but like the many, many teachers. We are who we are because somebody loved us in some way or another. I was lucky enough when I was a junior in high school I thought of writing in 2 completely separate ways, right? Like one was the writing you did for school. It was like the grades driven, academically oriented, get into a college, make my mother not like weep type shit, right? The other writing was music and musicality. And music probably was my very first literacy as a kid. I hated reading. I grew up like singing and all kinds of choirs. I was a musical theater kid. And then when I started really engaging, for better and for worse, which is like all up and down this book, in Black culture and Black politics, my sort of musicality curiosity shifted toward hip hop. And so much of the like music and work and sort of poetry and language that I was using was a kind of thing that didn't feel reserved for school. So I was writing like verses and 16-bar verses on like napkins or the backs of magazines and sharing them with friends. And it never occurred to me that those 2 things would ever intersect in a school-based space. Mm-hmm. And I had a teacher when I was a junior in high school who, same teacher that folks like Angel Nafis and Lauren Whitehead, both dear comrades of mine, would have also had. His name is Jeff Cass, who was very aware that I was creating things that were not what I was sort of like showing him. And he said, if you are creating things that like make you feel alive and that make you feel excited, you need to be turning those into me. And I said, well, that's not really That's like not what these assignments are. Your syllabus doesn't say shit about what I'm creating. And he's like, I don't mind. I don't care. If you are writing and creating stuff outside my class that feels valuable to you, I will give you a grade for it. And that idea, both that like my life could be academic subject matter worthy of exploring in school, and that teachers and mentors had the capacity to completely throw out with the bathwater a curriculum if it felt like a young person was like motivated and excited about a pursuit of themselves, was revolutionary for me, right? It obviously catapulted me into a career as a writer, one that really like centered around narrative and storytelling, and self-investigation. But it also really, I think, ignited a fire in me for education, because it was one of the first teachers that I had that made me feel like who I was legitimately enough. Like all of the strange, broken, disparate, separate parts of myself, while I was busy like being a really closeted queer kid in the Midwest, like being a varsity athlete and a musical theater kid, and like not letting those two groups meet ever, right? Just like splitting myself in as many ways as I could. A teacher that said all of those things are exactly who you are. You should use my classroom as a space to unpack them, address them, and talk about them, and I will give you a grade for them. And that pedagogy became the thing that underscored my desire to teach, that underscored my desire to want to have hard conversations with corporate America, that underscored my pursuit of a PhD, that underscored my desire to want to write books. So I'm grateful for that moment and that teacher. His name is Jeff Cass.
I love it, because my junior year English teacher also encouraged me to, you can probably start hearing my kids clomping around upstairs in this recording. She encouraged me to give her the poems that I had been writing outside of the class. And I even still have a folder of all of those poems that I gave her and her notes and comments on them. And it was really validating to have a teacher take the time out and say, like, tell me about what's important to you in your life, and to actually care what I was going to say. And I told Carlos about this too in our interview, that my very first experience as being a teaching artist, I had no teaching experience. I did not have a degree in that at all. And the only thing that I could do to kind of get my students to do anything on the first day, I was like, I don't know what to have them write about. So I said, write me a piece of writing, could be a poem or a story or a rhyme or whatever. Tell me about what's important to you.
Oh, mommy's in an interview.
This is real life right now that my kids are in here now. All right, come on over.
Mommy's
real quick. Come and say hi, and then you gotta go away.
Come say what's up. Meet me.
Go say.
Hey. Hi there.
Yeah, can you say what your name is? He can't see you over there, goofball. Come over here.
Can you see me? I'm waving at you, little guy.
Say hi. This is Thurgood. This is Thurgood.
Oh, and there's another.
And that's Vernon. I gave
What are your names again? Sorry.
That's Vernon, and this is Thurgood.
Thurgood.
Yep.
Great names.
Yep.
You guys have good names.
I gave them little old man names.
It's my grandfather's name.
Yep. It's every time you meet somebody says that's my grandfather's name, or I have an Uncle Vernon, you know. And, and then when people meet Thurgood, and he goes, I Thurgood. You know, and I'm like, yep, every time you Google your name forever, you're going to come up with someone that's not you.
Thurgood and Vernon. How are you guys doing today?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay,
doing all right.
You're so weird on camera all the time.
It's all right. It's Friday. We're supposed to be zany. I like that outfit a lot.
Yeah, we got a lot of superheroes up in here. We got to fix my backdrop. You can't push it.
I agree with that.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Are you guys going to be quiet for a couple minutes so I can finish this? Yeah. No, it's totally fine. I mean, it's funny because I interviewed another mompreneur the other day, and the whole entire interview, her kid is like in the screen, like yelling.
Oh my God, are you kidding? Like all bets are off. Like, first of all, this should be the only way we ever work, right? It's not that crazy. It's not that serious, but also truly all bets are off. The more the merrier.
Oh goodness, what'd you do? Oh, no, there's no crying in podcasts. Hold on a second. Seriously, that's totally like my life, my real life, you know. And she was like, "Are you sure you don't care that my kid's in the video?" I'm like, "That's your real life. Like that's how you work all day." And I have no problem with people seeing like, you know.
This is how this goes. This is how it is.
Exactly. And you know, I might not even edit that out. Whatever.
I hope you don't. I'll be offended if you do.
You know, I'll be like, that's real life. You know, like you're gonna listen to my podcast and you're gonna hear my kid crying in the middle of it because that's my real life. You know, and
yep.
You know, we can't edit everything. So anyway, number 2 on the list.
Okay, what else?
When you feel defeated or overcome, what do you tell yourself to keep going?
I have a bit of a mantra that I repeat to myself. I picked up like I think the thing I first tell myself is like, how can I be active? How can I like go outside, go for a run? How can I sweat? But a mantra that I repeat to myself through some meditation that I've like really engaged in over the course of the last couple years is, let's see if I can remember it. I love it because it always like, it takes me a moment while I'm like sitting and breathing to center on it. But it is, let's see, courage over intellect, compassion over fear, and what's the third one? I forget the third one. But usually courage over intellect, and then compassion over fear, and there's a third C, and I'm not recalling it right now, but it's repeating those things to myself again and again and again and again, because when I am scared, or when I'm just feeling depleted or against the wall, like I'm usually fairly unkind to myself. Mm-hmm. And that's where the compassion over fear comes in. And I often think that intellectualism or like big wordism or like it's sort of like a castle for smart people to hide in and protect themselves from feeling things. And I think that that's really easy to go to for me. So I remind myself that like the answer to whatever I'm feeling is not being able to describe it or articulate it or talk through it or weave a narrative out of it or create a piece of art out of it. It's just that like courage is more important than that. And being able to like name and dress language up around something is not courage. It's just an exercise that makes me feel less afraid. So those two things are powerful. I wish I had the third one. You
can always send it to me. I can put it in the show notes and then be like, cool. Everyone should zone in on that.
Got it. All right, I'll send it to you.
All right. So number 3, tell me about a way that you overcame a failure or a mistake and what you learned from it.
Oh my God. One time when, I mean, this isn't really a failure, but it is a childhood memory. I dumped an entire very, very hot bowl of spaghetti on my head and had to go to the hospital. I like reached up and an entire boiling bucket of water with pasta in it, pulled it right down on my head while my mother was cooking. And yeah, I mean, I very few breakthroughs, very few like developmental breakthroughs on the other side of that experience, on the other side of the like hospital bill that I bestowed onto my mother, other than I should just like listen to her with a little more like attention and gravity. And I still have the burns on my back to like prove it.
Oh, man. That's one way to learn, like, don't touch the stove. You're like, really?
Got it.
Touch the stove. Yes, for sure. I'll have to play that part for my kids and be like, yes, no, don't do it. Okay, number 4. What one trait or habit is most responsible for keeping you on track?
Trait or habit for keeping me on track. I think surrounding myself with people maybe that's it. Like surrounding myself with the right people, making sure that the right people are in my life. They're people that both call me on my shit, but are also really, really quick to remind me that I'm good at stuff, that I'm kind and thoughtful. Right. I take really seriously the idea that like blood and family and lineage is like kind of a chosen thing, and the community of beloveds that I have like been fortunate enough to like populate my life with. Mm-hmm. I'm going to know them when I'm 70. And I've like never been clearer on that. You know, of course it's a rotating door. People come and people go, but I'm a pretty social being, and the degree, and this maybe is kindred to our first conversation before we started recording about like some of those early slam relationships, right? People like Carlos, people whose lives I'll be in for a very, 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 very long time, that I trust both as like intimate friends, as well as thought partners and co-conspirators and fellow makers of stuff and collaborators, but also people who are like really unafraid to tell me about me, to whom I will listen.
Mm-hmm. I love this show. Oh my God. I love it. This is like, I've wanted to have a podcast for such a long time. Because I know that at my core, like the thing I'm most interested in life is the power of a single moment or a single conversation to change someone forever. Mm-hmm. Like a single interaction can just like totally change who you are, and it'll stay with you. And
it can.
I know that I personally have had so many of those with just so many amazing people, and I'm just so excited to have a space for those moments to live.
It's wonderful that you've created it. And I mean, you're clearly, you're a skilled space maker and holder. And yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for including me in this growing idea. You're clearly cut out to do it quite well.
Well, I mean, I was funny because in the other, this is my 3rd episode I've recorded today. So for anyone noticing, I'm wearing the same shirt as I was in the other 2. But I definitely have always had many focuses in my life, which is part of the reason that I've been sort of kind of growing 3 to 5 different businesses at the same time. Obviously, like I've been a poet. I started writing when I was like 5 years old. And was performing at 12 and started playing music when I was in college. So I had like my poetry thing. I did like the capital P at the poetry readings, and then I did the slam poetry, and then I'm an MC, and I played music solo for a really long time. And I've been in a band with my husband and a bunch of other guys since 2008. And, you know, play music and sing and rap and play the trumpet in the band and like have that kind of stage persona, and have been in the process of writing like 12 books, none of which are finished. And then running my business.
Right.
I was 19 years old. So
you're a multitasker.
I am. So it's great to finally make space in my creative zone to do this podcast. And I think it's kind of ends up that it's going to be the little link that really holds all of those different facets together, to kind of give us space for all those experiences, like people I met through business and other artists and writers and musicians and performers and change makers, like a space for, the importance of those relationships to have a space to hang out.
I really resonate with that, as someone whose life has been sort of peppered across industries and spaces for a long time. Like how increasingly careful, or at least attentive, I am becoming to like new opportunities that I say yes to, because the things I want to be doing pretty much from here on out are things that serve as like a pinching tool for all of my like respective worlds and spaces. Because as I'm sure you really know, it's really easy to feel like you're diluting yourself by running from thing to 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 thing. Meanwhile, like, you know, friends and colleagues and family members like chose a thing, and that's it. That's what they do. That's how they operate and evolve in the world. And I knew that would never be me, but I also know that it can feel really like depleting, or like you're watering yourself down. Mm-hmm. So I think the idea of, and I mean, in some ways that's what the book has done, right? It is like created a way for the various selves that we've like been giving ourselves to, the spaces we've been doling out our energies for years, to kind of like come together in a single artifact or space. And that can be very cathartic in some important ways, especially for those of us that are running around doing a lot. So I'm delighted to hear that this meets that need for you, because I wish that for folks that have the courage to take on multiple things at once simultaneously, and to have families and to be busy and working in the world. I wish that, because I think it's really important to be able to have things that contain the entirety of us. And if this is that, then I'm even more honored to be here. Yeah, it's been really cool. And there's just been so many kind of weird little serendipitous things that like I'm having conversations with all these people, but like there's things that you're saying that are connecting to things that the person in the interview right before you was talking about, even though you weren't there. And like that energy, like obviously the energy goes into me, and then the energy goes out to you. And that even though we are having these conversations in a virtual space, in a digital space, that the energy still transfers. I mean, just, you know, when you hear someone performing poetry or performing music on YouTube or on a CD, and that you get goosebumps because the energy that they are throwing out there is like still able to come through something that's not tangible. I think that is so cool. I mean, just like, that's it. You know, that's it.
As long as you put it out there that people can receive it. And cool, all of this has been in as a perfectionist type of person. I worked with a coach last year. She actually just interviewed her yesterday. But she's really has worked with me on the mantra of done is better than perfect. So I'm hopeful that people will forgive the imperfect nature of these conversations, and that sometimes people's video is kind of funky and sometimes the audio is a little funky, because that's just the world we live in these days.
That's the brave new world. It's all.
You can't sit on a couch with people, but it also gives me the opportunity to like talk to you in New York City while I'm sitting here in my office in Buffalo, and my employees are making paper right underneath me. Like, it's so cool.
There you go. Go.
The last question before you run away. What is the best piece of advice you've ever gotten? And what advice would you give to other people?
Oh boy. The best piece of advice I've ever gotten. The best piece of advice. This isn't advice, but it is. It's a reminder, and I guess it's that I am enough. I'm enough. I think, I don't know if like Carlos is very present because you brought him up, or because I'm about to get on a call with him in 15 minutes. But it's certainly like top of mind for me. And one of the things that he often talks about, or I talk about with he and his family often, is like how much of our work as educators and as artists is really like in pursuit of that constant reminder, both to ourselves and to other people we work with, right? Mm-hmm. It's like really what we're doing out here is like traveling from place to place to place to remind ourselves that like we're enough, but also to remind the people we love that, like, whoever you are and however you're showing up, if you're taking care of the people you love, if you're trying to like undo the violence of our inheritances and undo the violence of our histories, you're enough. There's no right or wrong way to be doing that. And I don't know, I'm not one for necessarily like giving advice to others, but I think in that same vein, right, like making sure that folks understand that their multiple selves and the multitudes that we contain are assets, right? Mm-hmm. It's easy to think that like to be more of one thing, you got to be less of another, especially professionally speaking. But I think it's true intimately and interpersonally too. To be more of X, you got to be less of Y. At some point in your life, you got to make choices about how you spend your time and your money and your resources and your labor, and all that shit is true. You need to be careful. You need to protect yourself. But being, tending to and gardening multiple selves simultaneously just makes you bigger. It makes you more. And I think increasingly the way the world is like shifting, we need people who are not just one thing, but who are conscious about how to be and how to show up for multiple people in multiple spaces. And I think that that's a particular trait that like queer people champion more than others, which is why I deeply, deeply love my queer family. But I also think that that is not a thing that is reserved for. I just think it's a skill that like queer folks develop. We wake up in the world and we're like, oh shit, all those different selves that I've been like trying to convince myself are like wrong. Mm-hmm. If I could just like wake up and acknowledge that they are all me and I am better and richer for embracing each one of them in this container, in this podcast, in this book, mm-hmm. then that's really powerful. And I think we spend a lot of time convincing ourselves and losing sleep and energy and self-love over trying to minimize the different parts of ourselves that are less palatable to like someone's expectations. And any effort to do that, or any effort to reject that rather, and celebrate your multitudes is something I am here for.
I love that. It's funny because more serendipity. Part of the urgency to start doing this podcast right now and just be like, get it out there, comes from watching Nico Tortorella's Instagram live show that they have been doing during the pandemic. It's called The Space Between, but they wrote this poetry book called All of It Is You. And I just love that, like, the last thing you're talking about kind of like ties into that like all of the parts of yourself are you and you should love them.
Yeah.
I know you have to run. Thank you so much for being on my podcast and for sharing yourself, all of yourselves, with everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for showing up at Heavy Hitters. Thank you for, dropping me a note, and thank you for being a fan of the work and all the work you're doing to create space for others.
Awesome. And I'll put links in the show notes where everyone can find you on the interwebs, cool. and go buy Adam's books. And thank you so much for being here on the Reach the Stars podcast today.
Thank you very much, Jana. Stay safe. Be well.
You too. Have a great day. Tell Carlos I said hi.
I will. Bye.
A single interaction has the power to change your life forever. This is a place for the stories of those moments. Stories of pursuing dreams, overcoming tragedy and failure, of coming back to life after so much of what feels like dying, of continuing on with only a vision as a map. This is the place where those moments live on. Come sit by the fire, look up at the stars, and be forever changed too.
Thank you for being with us on the Reach the Stars podcast. Our theme music is generously provided by Byrocratic. You can find him on bandcamp.com. Thank you to all of our current patrons, guests, and everyone else who helps make this dream a reality. We are so proud to be building this amazing community with all of you. If you love this podcast, please consider sharing with a friend, leaving a review on iTunes, and becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/reachthestars. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to see the videos of these conversations. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, do something cool and tell us about it.